But something glad to see those of you who are here the first time and those who are here for the first time. Welcome, and I want to recognize some folks that make all of this work. Nancy Bain is our pianist, and she's played for me for my classes for years, as well as on other occasions. So, Nancy Bain. Whitney Wolford. Whitney is the power behind many thrones in this institution, and without her, nothing would really work. I mean, she gets everything ready. She gets all the stools and the stands and the technical devices, and she makes sure they all work. So recognize Whitney. I mean, we got Clay Wolford, Clay, what am I talking about? Clay, I got it, he's Motley, okay, Clay Motley. Clay Motley is really the technical man around here, the fellow who makes everything work on stage, and when we have all of the singers and the dancers and the shows on stage, Clay is the man that makes sure that all of that works. So Clay certainly needs recognition. I can go on. I'm sure Jessica has also played some role in all of this. And so I thank all these people, and I apologize to any of them whose names I've left out. But anyway, we're doing a course these 5 weeks on the 12th century Renaissance, a title for these lectures taken from a book written in 1928, published in 1928, by a man named Charles Homer Haskins. Charles Homer Haskins is a historian who put medieval history in the spotlight. Before that, medieval history was downplayed significantly. We sang a song last time to the tune of Eternal Father, Strong to Save, about the way in which medieval history has been viewed, certainly since 1860, when a Swiss historian named Jacob Burckhardt, the thesis of his book about the history of the Renaissance in Italy, and goes on to say that the Renaissance was a rediscovery of the world and of man. And he went on to argue that the Middle Ages was nothing more than a time of disillusion, of illusion and faith, and his phrase, childish prepossession. What this course is attempting to do is to debunk such a notion, and to argue that there is a great deal more in that 1,000 years than Burckhardt and many people down to the present day have given to it. I used a device last time that I borrowed from an old historian named Norman Cannon. I'm taking him a person who really didn't exist, but I used that person to go through some historically accurate behavior and places, and to try to set the stage for the 12th century Renaissance. So we Anglo-Saxon monk from Yorkshire on his way down to Rome to assigned by his abbot to get an annulment, dispensation from the Pope. The Pope was Pope Leo IX, who had become Pope in 1046 and would be Pope until 1054. And so around 1050, this monk goes down, and I attempted to show in that lecture last week all of the new things that were popping up in the 11th century, the end of the 11th century, going into the 12th century period, which Haskins and I are calling the 12th century Renaissance. And I'm arguing that Renaissance is an appropriate word. Some folks say, hey, you can't do that. The Italian Renaissance is the only real Renaissance. What I'm arguing in this series of courses is that the Renaissance of the 12th century brought into existence more things that have affected your life and my life in the present than the things that took place in the Italian Renaissance in the 14th through the 16th century. If our monk had lived on, I mean, well, I'll tell you, you might ask, well, did the monk get the dispensation and did he bring greetings to Pope Leo IX? Of course he did. He accomplished all of that and then took the long road back to northeastern England. If he had lived the rest of that century, let's say he was 30 years old in 1050. If he had lived 50 more years and to the year 1100, going into the 12th century, what would he have seen? Well, some of you took some courses with me before we shut down for the COVID. I offered a course entitled Lessons from Revolutions, and a number of you attended those sessions. You remember that the first of those revolutions was what I call the Gregorian World Revolution. The Gregorian World Revolution, named after Pope Gregory VII. And about 1073 he became Pope, and he was Pope until 1085. All of this, of course, is in the 11th century, but I'm trying to set the stage for the 12th century in some of these things that I'm telling you now. And if the monk had lived through the rest of that century, he would have witnessed this revolution that was led by Pope Gregory VII, who was also called Hildebrand, which is a German word for firebrand, which aptly describes the character of this particular pope. And that revolution broke out in the 1070s. It was Pope Pope Gregory VII versus the king of Germany, who, I say Germany, there was no country called Germany, but in what we would now call Germany, there was a king named Henry IV, and Henry IV is going to lock horns with Gregory VII in the Great Revolution when it was finally settled in the 12th century, the early 12th century, 1122, that what was called the Concordat of Worms of the Orium Est, the popes had gained considerable advantage. They had stopped the whole practice of kings and emperors selecting and appointing clerics at all levels, priests and abbots and bishops to their sees or to their church offices. And so he would have witnessed that, and he would have also, in the last years of his life, if he died in the year 1100, he would see the outbreak of the Crusades. The Crusades, another pope named Urban II, in a French town of Clermont, traveled from Rome to Clermont, where he gave a speech in which he called upon all people in Europe to lock hands together and go to the Holy Land and dispel the Seljuk Turks who were there desecrating the holy places and killing Christians. And after he finished this rousing sermon, all of the people cried, God wills it, God wills it. And they took off, some of them just walking across Europe, had no idea what they were doing and exactly how to get there and what they would do when they got there. Some went down to the seashore, got on boats, and that was 1095. 4 years later, in 1099, the first real crusade took place. The great lords and nobles of Europe led that crusade. But we'll talk about that when you get back from being off next week. You know, you don't come to class next week. We're skipping that day because something else is going on in our room. So our next class after the day is going to be October the 3rd. So I don't want to see a soul next week in this room. So there's no class next week, so don't come next week. But when you do come back, the whole lecture is going to be on the Crusades, at least on the first 4 of the Crusades. So hope I'll see you all then. All right, well, so let's get down to brass tacks for today. And we haven't sung our song yet. Let's sing our song. And remember the last line of the song is let's see, devotional on the me, and I never say, but we shall see cause what we shall see. Okay, so don't jump in too early on that. Nancy will play it through once, and then it's right on the front of your song, of your sheet, your outline. So let's kind of warm up and sing our song, okay? Okay, Nancy. A little tricky ending, okay? All right, let's see if we can do it. Here we go. Oh, won't you come along with me? We're going to class to study history. We may not get from A to Z, but we shall see what we shall see. While you're at it, I'd like for us to turn to a couple of my little ditties here because this one captures something of what we've already talked about and what we're going to talk about today. Look at the song of the 12th century Renaissance, the tune In Old New York by Victor Herbert. The third stanza, while all this was going on, Europe began to change. Cities sprang up, merchants appeared, and banks were all over the range. Great Gothic arches soared above, and in this town and in that, and students flocked to many a school. The goose was fat. Okay? It's to the tune of In Old New York. Nancy will play that one for you too. And there's historical truth in every line here, so I don't think this is just nonsense. Okay? Let's hear it. Don't sing yet. got one more we'll sing a little later on, so you can turn your head to the back page. We're going to sing about Peter Applewhite later on in the lecture today. Well, in the piece that we just sang, we talked about schools. And one of the big innovations in the 12th century Renaissance, and of course all these things begin, history doesn't just start just like that in a century. It always leads up, history's continuous. And so what happens is that the cathedrals have schools, and mostly the people who went to those schools would later become priests, but the schools, what we call cathedral schools, the cathedral schools also taught more widely. There were two different kinds of schools. In Southern Europe, there were schools that were dominated by the students. Students called all the shots. The students determined what subjects they wanted to study. They selected the professors. They paid the professors. And so it's called the studium generale, or the students who were joined together for specific purpose, and that purpose was to gain education. Now, one of the things about the 11th and 12th centuries is that people are really interested in education for the first time in several centuries. It wasn't until the attack stopped upon Western Europe before 1000 and peace came to Western Europe, and population began to grow, and the schools began to blossom, the cathedral schools. And they developed a curriculum. The curriculum was called the Seven Liberal Arts. The seven liberal arts, and they had among the seven, they were divided into two groups. One was the 3 ways of learning, and the other was the 4 ways of learning. 3 ways of learning in Latin was called the trivium, and the 4 ways of learning was called the quadrivium. Now, I know you're delighted to hear that. You can't wait to go and tell your friends about it. And anyway, this is very important curriculum, which, interestingly enough, it survived the centuries, and basically in modern universities, the 7 liberal arts are in some way, shape, or form are still the pathway to knowledge and the pathway to gaining status in life. The 3 ways of learning were grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic. Grammar, it was not simply learning the parts of speech and tenses and all that kind of thing, although it was that. But grammar included the study of literature and history, and so what the grammar was intended to do was to give the student content. Rhetoric was to enable the student to speak about that content, to speak of it in a very clear and eloquent way. And the third, dialectic, was to enable the student to argue convincingly that student's point of view, what that student has learned. Grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic were the 3 ways of learning, and the 4 ways of learning will strike you as a little strange, but arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music were the 4 ways of learning. Arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. And most all of these were geared toward the ecclesiastical life, that is, church life. The music was the music that was sung in the cathedrals. The cathedrals were just starting to go up, I might indicate, but we'll deal with that later. And astronomy is more astrology, imagine doing arithmetic with Roman numerals. Have you ever tried adding and subtracting and dividing with Roman numerals? Well, that's what they had to do with arithmetic. They were the universities of students, and a good example of one of those would be Bologna, Italy. That was probably the most famous of the universities developing out of the cathedrals by students. It was Paris where the faculty dominated. The faculty set the curriculum, the faculty determined what was required for students to graduate, how long it takes, and so on. And so they were called the University of Students in the South, in Southern Europe, University of Faculty in more Northern Europe. And out of the cathedral schools will develop the universities. And once you have completed your undergraduate work, which took you about 6 years, and you didn't have to go to class. What you did was you could go to class, and the faculty member would not so much lecture to you as he would, what they said, gloss the text. That is, he would have some authoritative text from earlier in medieval history, and he would comment upon that text and usually would write down in the margin of the text his comments about that, and then read those to the students. Does that sound like a very exciting class to you? It doesn't to me. I mean, it's hard to believe that students flock to hear a professor read some rather arcane comments on texts that were found in early medieval books. But one of the most famous books that they would have read would have been a Latin translation of a famous Greek writer whose name was Aristotle. You all know about Aristotle, but before the Roman Empire collapsed in about the 5th century, a Roman who was, the Roman Empire was no longer, actually it had already collapsed, and he was in the court of one of the Germanic invader tribes, the Ostrogoths. The fellow's name was Boethius, and Boethius had translated the logical writings of Aristotle. Aristotle wrote a lot more than about logic, but he did write about logic, and so when the Roman Empire collapsed and medieval started, the logical writings of Aristotle were kind of submerged, and they didn't pop up again until the time of peace after 1000 AD. And it became an extremely important document that students just really wanted. In fact, by 1100, the students and faculty in Western Europe were referring to Aristotle as the philosopher, because his logic was helping them to try to understand their religion. Now, you run into a problem when people begin to use reason to understand and appreciate their religion. For 5 centuries in the Middle Ages, people had pretty much accepted authority. That is, the dictates of popes, the conclusions of church councils, the writings of the church fathers, and so the whole idea was we already know the truth. What we need to do is simply pass it on to you, and you learn it, you memorize it. Well, as a result of the development of cities and towns and commerce and industry and banking and all the new kinds of things that were going on, the Gregorian Revolution, the beginning of the Crusades, all these things were beginning to pull people up by their roots, and they were feeling the need to try to see if there wasn't some way to understand and make their faith more believable if they could also apply reason and logic and understanding to matters of religion. Well, one of the dangers in that is a danger for people who value faith, is that it's possible once you begin to use reason to understand and explain faith, the possibility is, you've all heard of the slippery slope, is that you can begin to explain religion and faith away. And so some of the more conservative voices, like St. Bernard of Clairvaux, is greatly disturbed by these attempts by scholars who begin to apply reason to understand faith and religion. But one of the earliest examples of someone who attempted to do that was an Italian came, and his name was oh, for goodness sake, Anselm, A-N-S-E-L-M, Anselm. He came from northern Italy, right at the foot of the Italian Alps. Just as you start to go up and up, and either go across to France, or as you come in the other way, go down to Italy. Excuse me. And so Anselm was born in Aosta, Italy, A-O-S-T-A, but he soon moved to a French city called Bec, B-E-C. That was an abbey at Bec, and he became a resident in the abbey. And while he was there, in about, I think it was the year 1072, he was doing maintenance in what do you call it, in his religious service. And the lesson for the day was Psalm 14. And the Psalm 14 opens with the words, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God." The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Incidentally, this psalm is also repeated verbatim later on in the Psalms. What is it, Psalm 53? Maybe I can't give you that for sure. But in any event, Psalm 14, Anselm had read that passage many times, and he never thought any more about it. But somehow or another, and the somehow or another was all the changes that are going on around him now, all the Aristotelian logic and dialectic and logic and reason. And Anselm becomes a part of all of that. And he asks himself, maybe at the time, or maybe when he gets back to his cell, why does the psalmist say that, why does the psalmist call a person who says there is no God a fool? So Anselm thought about it. He tried to reason it. He says, well, when one says God, what does one mean? And he thinks about it, and he says, well, I think most people would agree that God is, and these are his very words, God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. So Anselm would then say to you, or to the atheist maybe, would you agree that that's an acceptable definition for us to talk about God? That God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived? And most people, I mean, most of you, I think, would say, oh, that's okay. I mean, that's a lot more to it than that, but we'll take that as a starter. Okay, and some would say, well, which is greater? A God that you just think about or conceive in your mind, or a God who exists in external, I don't mean God's a bottle of water, but God exists in external reality. So quite apart. I mean, I don't even have to think about this. It exists. So, if God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, and something that exists in external reality is greater than something that's only conceived in one's mind, God necessarily exists. And the reason that the psalmist calls the man who denies God's existence a fool, because what he's doing is affirming and denying in the same sentence, and people who do that are fools. I'm sure you're all with me now, right? Anyway, this becomes really a very big philosophical argument. It's come, and philosophers have argued it from that time down to the present day. And it's called the ontological, that is to say, an argument from being. An argument from being, that is existing. The ontological argument for the existence for God. And it's gone through all kinds of, some great philosophers have said it's completely off base. Others affirm it down to the present day. But my point is, here, what's going on now, one of the big new things that's breaking out is the rediscovery of Aristotle's logic and the application of logic and reason to try to understand one's religious beliefs more firmly. Anselm says, I don't need reason and logic in order to hold the dogma, the doctrine, but it's helpful for me to understand and to explain it to other people. And that's what I want to do. But St. Bernard of Clairvaux said, hold on, you're doing great harm to the students who might come to your classes and listen to what you have to say when you apply reason to revelation. It's simply wrong for you to do that. But Anselm was a man of such virtue and such stature. Eventually, he even became the Archbishop of Canterbury. He was Archbishop of Canterbury until his death in 12, and he died in 1107. But he says, I think the fact that he was a man of such dignity and of such learning that the church, the part of the church that disciplined people who got off base in their religious beliefs and teachings, that they couldn't touch him. But he was nothing, that is Anselm, compared to a young scholar. Well, he was not young, I think he was in his 30s when he was a little younger than that, when he became a student in one of the cathedral schools in Paris. The man's name is Peter Abelard. Peter Abelard. He had great thirst for knowledge. I really wonder, I think, I'm trying to think of my students in 40 years that I taught at DCU. I felt that they came to class with some of the same urgency and some of the same desire with which the students in the late 11th and 12th century come to class. I mean, these students are, I told you that they will come from miles and miles where they will endure all kinds of indignities. They will endure poverty. They will live in terribly indecent conditions. They'll, but yet they are determined to learn. They want knowledge. They want to know because they believe that if they gain knowledge, they will understand who they are and where they are in life and what they can do with themselves in life. And it's hard to believe the sense of urgency, the deep desire that these students have to come to class. Well, Abelard was one of those students. He came from Brittany, which is up in northwestern France, and a very rough and rather barbaric area. But his father wanted him to stay and farm, but he wanted to come to Paris and study. He did, but he was a brilliant student. And remember that this is before the faculty really takes over, and you have faculty-dominated universities in Paris. It's still in the cathedral school that students come, and the faculty members literally live by their wits. That is to say, if faculty members do not teach the students in such a way that they are learning what they came to class to do, then they hire some other faculty member to teach them who will give them what they want to know and what they expect to learn. And so Abelard came to class and he heard some of the most brilliant professors at the time. And he would put questions to his faculty members, and if the faculty member hesitated or Abelard thought that the answer that the faculty member gave was not an adequate or correct answer, Abelard would say, well, then I'll tell you the answer. And he'd stand up in the class and he would give the answer. Now, you know, most faculty members now hate students who do that kind of thing. But Abelard just stood up and the students began to listen to Abelard, and they came to him after class and said, look, you really can teach. How about teaching us? We'll pay you to teach. And Abelard says, why not? I mean, this is kind of Abelard day. He's rapidly egotistic. I think most teachers are somewhat egotistic, but Abelard was rapidly so. I mean, there's no question. He began to think very early that he was the greatest, and really you can't criticize him too much because he really came very close to being the greatest. Early in his life, when he was 21, he will write a book entitled About the Trinity, about the Holy Trinity. Now, after the Council of Nicaea, way back in the 4th century, had settled, and then a couple of church councils after that, by the 7th or 8th centuries anyway, the whole question of the Holy Trinity had been settled. Nicene Creed stated it all. People had to believe every word of that, and often they could get into very real trouble if they didn't. And so most people left it alone. You just say, yeah, I believe it, or I'm going to go ahead and repeat the words of the creed and never question it. But Abelard questions everything. And he questions it. He writes a book about the things that he questions that bother him about it. Well, that was early, and already St. Bernard of Clairvaux read that book, and he said, this guy's dangerous. He's going to ruin the student population if somebody doesn't stop him. Well, Abelard kept on teaching. He was 37 years old. One day, one of his students, a young woman, not many women came to class, but a 17-year-old woman came to class. She was the daughter of Fulbert, who was canon in the cathedral, in one of the cathedrals in Paris. And she was absolutely brilliant as well. Also, according to all the contemporary records, she was very beautiful, very lovely young lady. Well, to make a long story short, 37-year-old Abelard saw 17-year-old Heloise and said, you know, I'd like to get her to know her better. She wanted to learn so much that she asked her uncle, who I said uncle earlier, I hope I said uncle, Fulbert, asked him if she couldn't have Abelard give her special instructions beyond class. And so Fulbert asked Abelard about doing it, and Abelard said, well, it would be better if I could come to your residence where Heloise is and give her instructions. So, Abelard will write a book shortly after he meets Heloise entitled The History of My Calamities. History of My Calamities. Because what happened, and Abelard tells us in that book, The History of My Calamities, he said that when he and Heloise studied late into the evenings, as the figures were pointing to the various glosses on the texts of the the books that they were reading, that their fingers then began to move closer and closer together, and they joined hands, and hands then moved to other parts of the anatomy and so on. And within a year, Heloise was pregnant. Then her uncle found this out. He was enraged and got Heloise's brothers to break into Abelard's apartment one night, and Abelard described it. He said that they cut off those parts of my anatomy which were the reason for the sorrow that they experienced. That's a very delicate way of saying that they castrated him. And so the result of that was he could no longer be an abbot or a priest, or at least he didn't think he could. And so he became a monk, and he said he arranged for Heloise to go into a convent. And so they eventually married, but Abelard retired both of them retired to Brittany for a while. The child was born, and as Abelard and Heloise lay out under the stars on the hillside in Brittany, looking up at the stars, they thought they were both very intelligent, very interested in exploring everything new, and they thought of the astrolabe that used to measure the distance of the stars and so on. And they named the newborn son Astrolabe. And so Abelard and Heloise had a son named Astrolabe. One of them in an abbey, the other in a convent. Abelard came back after a few years to teach in Paris, and for a while Bernard could not get his hands on him, and in those years Abelard, thousands upon thousands of students came to hear Abelard teach. I would love, and you can tell that he's one of my great medieval heroes, and I'll spend all this time on him. But he wrote, he continued to write until they finally condemned him to silence. Abelard led that, St. Bernard of Clairvaux led that attack on him, and in 1140, the church declared that Peter Abelard could not speak or write any further books. And the last 2 years of his life, he just kind of drifted away, and he was taken in by the abbot of the monastery I told you about, the one near Lyon, France. The great monastery in France. Peter the Venerable was the abbot at the time, and Peter the Venerable took Abelard in the last 2 years of his life. Heloise outlived him about 20 years, and later on Abelard's body was moved to the abbey, to the convent where Heloise had become abbess. And when she died, about 20 years later, there's a story that it's apocryphal, of course, that she was buried with Abelard. Abelard opened his arms to receive her. You think, when you think of Jacob Burckhardt saying that you couldn't find individuals in the Middle Ages, I want to read you just a little portion of some of the letters. This is a portion of a letter that Heloise wrote to Abelard, and she's expressing her love to him. She says, "The pleasures of loving which we have tasted together have been so sweet that I cannot despise them, not even efface their memory without great difficulty. Wherever I turn, there they confront me with their eternal longing. Even in my sleep, their shadows pursue me. It is not until the time of Mass, when prayer should be purest, that the obscene imagining of these pleasures so completely overwhelm me. And I yield to their shameful delectations rather than to prayer. I, who should tremble at what I have done, sigh after what I have lost. Nor is it only what we have done, but the very places, the moments when we have been together that are so deeply graven into my heart that once more I see them with you in all their plenitude. If you command me to go to hell because of my love for you, I will go. And you men get a level like that ever? Well, let's sing a song about Peter Abelard. Turn in your book, and it's to the old New York. This is the one at the top of the last page on the back. Everybody see it? A prof named Peter Abelard, all the young scholars, they flogged him and gladly paid tuition in Frankish dollars. Okay. But Friar Bernard thought Pete too cute was spouting heresy. So Bernie brought smart Pete to court and condemned Pete. You get all that in? All right, let's see what we can do, Nancy. All right, you ready to go? Here, let's try it. A prophet Peter and the Lord enthralled the young scholars. They thronged to him and gladly paid tuition and Frankish dollars. But Friar Bernard thought Pete too cute was spouting heresy. So Bernie brought smart Pete to court and condemned me. Did you get it all in? You want to do it one more time? Sure. One more time. Put yourself into it. It doesn't matter if you make a mistake. Everybody makes mistakes, okay? Here we go. A prophet Peter and the Lord enthralled the young scholars. They thronged to him and gladly paid tuition and Frankish dollars. But Friar Bernard thought Pete too cute was spouting heresy. So Bernie brought smart Pete to court and condemned me. Okay, I'll see you in 2 weeks, October the 3rd, for the Crusades. Good day.